The United States military and the demobilization of South American drug trafficking, an extensive analysis and speculative essay. The illicit drug trade in South America, particularly the production and trafficking of cocaine, fentanyl, and other narcotics, has long been a focal point of United States national security policy. The region's complex socio-political landscape, marked by poverty, weak governance, and entrenched criminal networks, has made it a persistent hub for drug trafficking organizations, DTOs. Recent developments, including the Trump administration's 2025 designation of several Latin American cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, and directives for military action, signal a potential escalation in U.S. efforts to curb this trade. This essay analyzes how the U.S. military could, and likely will, attempt to demobilize South American drug trafficking operations with a focus on their displacement into other countries. Drawing on historical precedents, current policy shifts, and speculative scenarios, it explores the mechanisms, challenges, and unintended consequences of such interventions, while critically examining the broader implications for global security and sovereignty.
Historical context: the U.S. military's role in the war on drugs. The U.S. has a long history of involving its military in counter-narcotics efforts in Latin America, often with mixed results. Since the 1970s, the war on drugs has seen significant U.S. investment in the region, with initiatives like Plan Colombia, 2000 to 2016, and the Merida Initiative, 2008-present, aimed at disrupting drug production and trafficking. Plan Colombia, for instance, allocated over $10 billion to train Colombian forces, eradicate coca crops, and target cartel leaders, reducing Colombia's dominance in cocaine production, but pushing cultivation into Peru and Bolivia. Similarly, the Merida Initiative provided Mexico with $1.6 billion to bolster law enforcement and border security. Yet violence surged, with over 70,000 deaths attributed to cartel conflicts between 2006 and 2012. These efforts highlight a recurring pattern. Militarized interventions often disrupt trafficking networks temporarily but displace operations to less regulated regions, a phenomenon known as the balloon effect. For example, intensified operations in Colombia forced traffickers to shift routes through Central America, particularly Guatemala and Honduras, where weaker governance facilitated new smuggling corridors. The 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama to arrest Manuel Noriega, a drug trafficking figure, further underscores the precedent for direct military action, though it was condemned by the United Nations as a violation of international law. These historical interventions provide a framework for understanding how current U.S. military strategies might unfold, and their potential to push drug trafficking into new territories.
Current policy shifts, a new era of militarization. In 2025, the Trump administration's aggressive stance against Latin American cartels marks a significant escalation. By designating groups like Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, Venezuela's Tren de Aragua, and the alleged Cartel de los Soles as FTOs, the U.S. has unlocked counterterrorism authorities, enabling covert operations and military strikes. Reports indicate the Pentagon has been directed to deploy air and naval forces to the southern Caribbean to target narco-terrorist organizations, with at least 7 warships and 4,000 personnel mobilized in response to perceived threats from Venezuela. Additionally, the U.S. has intensified drone surveillance over Mexico to locate fentanyl labs, signaling a shift toward high-tech military-led operations. This approach diverges from traditional law enforcement strategies, which relied on cooperation with regional governments through agencies like the DEA. The FTO designation allows the U.S. to treat cartels as existential threats akin to terrorist groups, potentially justifying unilateral actions without host nation consent. However, this raises legal and diplomatic concerns, as Mexico and Venezuela have explicitly rejected U.S. military intervention, citing violations of sovereignty. The precedent of the 1989 Panama invasion, coupled with Trump's reported inquiries in 2020 about missile strikes on Mexican drug labs, suggests a willingness to push legal boundaries, possibly invoking self-defense or national security to bypass international law. The U.S. military's approach to demobilizing South American drug trafficking is likely to involve a multi-pronged strategy, combining direct action, intelligence operations, and pressure on regional governments. Below are the key mechanisms through which this could occur. Direct military operations. The U.S. could deploy special forces, such as the 7th Special Forces Group, to conduct targeted strikes or capture operations against cartel leaders and infrastructure, particularly in Mexico and Venezuela. These operations might mirror the 2024 arrest of Sinaloa cartel co-founder Ismael El Mayo Zambada, which relied on U.S. intelligence and law enforcement coordination. However, unilateral strikes such as drone attacks on fentanyl labs risk escalating tensions as seen in Mexico's rejection of Trump's 2025 offer to deploy troops. Naval and air interdiction. The U.S. Southern Command, SOUTHCOM, has already intensified operations in the Caribbean, deploying warships and surveillance aircraft to intercept drug shipments. The Coast Guard, with its dual role as a military and law enforcement agency, will likely play a central role, leveraging 34 bilateral agreements with regional nations to facilitate interdictions. For example, in 2020, the Coast Guard seized over 23,000 pounds of cocaine, worth $411.3 million, demonstrating its capacity to disrupt maritime trafficking routes. Economic and diplomatic pressure. The U.S. has imposed tariffs on Mexico and Canada to compel cooperation against cartels, a tactic that could extend to South American nations like Colombia or Bolivia. By threatening economic sanctions or withholding aid, the U.S. could pressure governments to align with its counter-narcotics agenda, potentially forcing cartels to seek new operational bases in less resistant countries. Cyber and intelligence operations. The CIA's increased drone surveillance and potential use of cyber tools to disrupt cartel communications and financial networks could weaken their operational capacity.
Speculative scenarios. Displacement into other countries. The U.S. military's aggressive campaign is likely to disrupt established trafficking networks in South America, but historical patterns suggest this will displace operations rather than eradicate them. The balloon effect, observed in Colombia and Mexico, indicates that intensified pressure in one region pushes traffickers to exploit vulnerabilities elsewhere. Below are speculative scenarios for how and where drug trafficking might shift. Central America as a new hub, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, already transit points for 90% of cocaine entering the U.S., are prime candidates for increased trafficking activity. These countries' weak governance, corruptible officials, and proximity to Mexico make them attractive for cartels displaced from Colombia or Venezuela. The Central America Regional Security Initiative, CARC, funded with $800 million since 2008, has failed to curb this trend, and militarized U.S. operations could exacerbate violence in these northern-tier countries. For instance, the 2019 expansion of coca cultivation in Guatemala mirrors earlier shifts from Colombia. Emerging route in the Caribbean. With U.S. naval deployments in the southern Caribbean, cartels may pivot to smaller island nations like Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, or the Bahamas, which have less robust maritime defenses. The Caribbean was a major trafficking route in the 1980s before shifting to Central America, and a return to this corridor is plausible. The 2023 surge in homicides in Costa Rica, linked to drug trafficking, suggests the region's vulnerability to such displacement. Expansion into Africa and Europe. As U.S. interdiction efforts intensify in the Western Hemisphere, cartels may redirect cocaine shipments to Europe via West Africa, a route already used for 25 to 30% of global cocaine production. Countries like Guinea-Bissau and Nigeria, with porous borders and corruptible governments, have served as transshipment points since the 2000s. Increased U.S. pressure could accelerate this trend, with Brazilian and Argentine ports acting as key exit points for South American drugs. Bolivia and Peru as production centers, with Colombia's cocaine production declining from 700 metric tons in 2001 to 195 metric tons in recent years. Peru and Bolivia have emerged as primary coca producers. U.S. military action targeting Colombian or Venezuelan cartels could push production deeper into these Andean nations, where rugged terrain and limited state presence offer ideal conditions for illicit cultivation. The 2016 demobilization of Colombia's FARC, which ceded control of coca production, already shifted cultivation to these countries, a trend likely to intensify. Venezuela's growing role. Despite U.S. claims about the Cartel de los, evidence of a centralized drug trafficking network led by Nicolas Maduro is inconclusive. However, Venezuela's economic collapse and lax border controls make it a potential haven for displaced traffickers. If U.S. military operations target Venezuelan criminal networks, cartels could exploit clandestine airstrips in Apure or maritime routes along the Orinoco River, further entrenching Venezuela as a trafficking hub.
Challenges and unintended consequences. While the U.S. military's resources and technological prowess offer significant advantages, several challenges could undermine its efforts to demobilize South American drug trafficking, sovereignty and diplomatic backlash. Unilateral military actions, especially without host nation consent, risk inflaming anti-American sentiment across Latin America. Mexico's rejection of U.S. troop deployments and Venezuela's accusations of warmongering highlight the diplomatic fallout. The 1989 Panama invasion, condemned by the UN, serves as a cautionary tale, as does the 1840s Mexican-American War, which fueled Mexican nationalism. Such interventions could unify Latin American nations against U.S. interference, complicating regional cooperation. Human rights concerns. Militarized enforcement often leads to civilian casualties and human rights abuses, as seen in Mexico's drug war, where 460,000 homicides have occurred since 2006. The use of military force against cartels, especially in densely populated areas, risks collateral damage, particularly if international humanitarian law is invoked to justify lethal force. Civilians in gang-controlled territories, often coerced into compliance, could face sanctions or harm, further destabilizing communities. Fragmentation and violence, targeting cartel leaders, as seen in Mexico's kingpin strategy, often splinters organizations, leading to turf wars and increased violence. The 2016 FARC demobilization in Colombia fragmented the cocaine market, empowering smaller, more volatile groups. Similar outcomes could occur in Venezuela or Mexico, driving traffickers to new regions and escalating local conflicts. Economic and social drivers. Poverty and inequality fuel the drug trade, with 45.6% of Colombians and 25% of Mexicans living below the poverty line in 1985, a trend that persists. Militarized approaches fail to address these root causes, as seen in the continued profitability of drug trafficking, which employs 165,000 people in Mexico alone. Without economic development, displaced traffickers will find new recruits in vulnerable regions.
Speculative outcomes as shifting global drug trade. Looking ahead, the U.S. military's campaign is likely to reshape the global drug trade in unpredictable ways. A speculative scenario might unfold as follows. Intense U.S. operations in Mexico and the Caribbean disrupt Sinaloa and Tren de Aragua networks, forcing them to relocate fentanyl and cocaine operations to Honduras and Guatemala. These countries, already struggling with gang violence, see a surge in homicides mirroring Costa Rica's 2023 spike. Simultaneously, Peruvian and Bolivian cartels ramp up coca production, using Brazil as a transshipment point to Europe via West Africa. Venezuela, under pressure from U.S. naval blockades, becomes a chaotic hub for clandestine trafficking, with cartels exploiting its ungoverned spaces. In this scenario, the U.S. achieves short-term successes, such as high-profile arrests or drug seizures. But the global supply chain adapts. Europe's cocaine market grows, fueled by redirected South American shipments, while Africa becomes a new battleground for trafficking networks. The U.S. military's focus on kinetic operations, without addressing demand or poverty, perpetuates the cycle of displacement, echoing the failures of Plan Colombia and the Merida Initiative. Critical perspective beyond militarization. Critics argue that the U.S. military's approach to drug trafficking is inherently flawed, rooted in a prohibitionist framework that fuels organized crime rather than dismantling it. The $2.5 trillion spent on the war on drugs over 4 decades has not reduced drug use in the U.S., where 35.3 million people have used cocaine and 8.5 million have used crack. Militarized strategies, like those proposed in 2025, risk exacerbating violence and human rights abuses, while ignoring demand-side solutions such as decriminalization or addiction treatment. Moreover, the neoliberal economic policies tied to U.S. initiatives, such as Plan Colombia's support for privatization, have deepened inequality, driving vulnerable populations into the drug trade. A more effective strategy might combine targeted military actions with robust economic and social interventions. For instance, investing in rural development in Bolivia and Peru could reduce reliance on coca cultivation, while strengthening civilian law enforcement in Central America could curb corruption without escalating violence. Regional cooperation, as seen in the UNODC's Central America Regional Program, offers a model for building local capacity rather than imposing external force.
Conclusion. The U.S. military's potential demobilization of South American drug trafficking is a high-stakes endeavor with far-reaching implications. While direct operations, naval interdictions, and intelligence efforts could disrupt cartels in Mexico, Venezuela, and Colombia, the historical balloon effect suggests trafficking will shift to Central America, the Caribbean, Africa, and beyond. The challenges of sovereignty, human rights, and economic drivers underscore the limitations of a militarized approach, which risks perpetuating violence and displacement without addressing root causes. As the U.S. navigates this complex landscape, a balanced strategy, one that pairs targeted enforcement with social investment and regional collaboration, offers the best hope for sustainable progress. Yet, as history shows, the drug trade's resilience may outpace even the most determined military campaigns, leaving the world to grapple with its ever-evolving shadow.